This diagram, which I took up from Saldana, will give us some an overview illustration of how a qualitative data analysis look like. In this diagram, you can see data. Data here is referring to the raw data. Normally, we obtain from interview, which then we transcribe into words, or maybe observation, and then we transcribe into words as well. These are typical data for qualitative research. And then researcher need to do first cycle of coding. In this first cycle of coding, the role of the researcher is to read the data and code the data into similar characteristic. And then from the data, from the code, researcher need to go through another cycle of coding, which is called second cycle of coding. The purpose of the second cycle of coding is to categorize codes into similar categories. And then finally, based on the codes and categories, researcher can come up with findings for their research. Okay, while doing the coding, researcher need to make decision on what is the best coding method they can choose. Of course, in choosing coding methods is highly depending on the research question. This book by Saldana, this book is actually on coding methods. So he suggested lots of coding methods depending on what is the research outcome that the researcher would like to contribute at the end of the research. For the purpose of this presentation, I will rely on one example of research question, which is how do managers identify performance problems among their subordinates? So therefore, for this kind of research question, according to Saldana, causation coding method is suitable because it allows the researcher to examine the way a person thinks about relationship between a cause and an outcome. Take, for example, this is the research question. How do managers identify performance problems among subordinates? Therefore, when a researcher relies on causation coding method, what it does is when the researcher code from the raw data, the researcher is try to uncover what the managers believe the reason behind employees' performance issues. Okay, so from there we can see when we do the coding, using this method, what we do, we try to put a code between a cause and an outcome. Let's look at example how to do causation coding. In this table, you can see a sample of raw data. Okay, the raw data is basically the conversation between the interviewer and the respondent or the informant of the research. And then based on the raw data and the role of the researcher when the researcher is doing the causation coding is to pick up three interrelated codes that can explain what has caused what. Yeah, meaning code A has caused code B, and code B has caused code C. Okay, so from this example, it's about what gives signals to the employers of employees' performance. So the respondent gives some answer on what the respondent think on the signals of poor performance, and then as a researcher we need to translate this raw data into three interrelated codes. And then from the first cycle of coding, and then we move on to the second cycle of coding. And the purpose of this second cycle of coding is to group codes, the codes that we get from the first cycle of coding. And now we're going to group them into similar categories and subcategory. And here at this point, the role of the researcher is to identify pattern. And then the way we do it is by looking at the connections between the codes and categories. Saldana suggested pattern coding because at this stage, at the second cycle of coding, if we rely on a pattern coding during our second cycle of coding, what we're doing here as a researcher is to make decision and which code will make the most analytic sense to form research findings. So basically, when we're doing this, when we make decision, we need to choose because from the first cycle of coding, we might end up with thousands of codes, and now we have to make decision out of these thousands. How do we choose the most salient categories that help us to answer our research question? So at this point is we really need to be guided by our research question so that the codes that we have derived from the first cycle of coding, we only use this code for the purpose of categories that will help us to answer the research question. Let's consider an example of pattern coding. From here, you can see here some from the first cycle of coding. In the example that I'm using is I use causation coding method, and then we have code A, code B, code C. In this example, I have 3 respondents. So we put them in a row and column, and based on the pattern that we have, code A, code B, code C, and then we think about how are they similar to each other. Okay, so in this example, they are similar in terms of the manager's queue, because of the research objective is to look into signal that the manager received that tell the managers these are poor performance. Okay, so the categories I have is manager's queue, and then different respondent will give different queue. For example, the first respondent, Badrul, the queue that Badrul gets by when observing his employees is about work not progressing. And Delilah, according to Delilah, the manager's queue is monitoring work outcome and behavior. That's how Delilah knows that the employees are not performing. And from Chempaka, she looks into behavior as a secondary, whereas the output is the primary. So from the code that we get from the first cycle, and then we move on to the second cycle of coding, we look at similarity. So in this example, they are similar in terms of cues that managers receive that tell the managers these are poor performers. And then based on the sample of data that I have presented, and also based on the research question, I try to illustrate to you how do managers identify performance problems among their subordinates. So the finding that I derive from the codes is work output is the primary cue, while the behavior is the secondary cue. I come up with this finding based on the category, which is manager's queue, and the subcategories under manager queues, which are work not progressing, monitoring work outcome and behavior is secondary. From this finding, I can conclude that the managers identify performance problem among subordinates by firstly observing the subordinates' work output, then their behavior. To conclude, in qualitative research, researchers rely on the coding process to do data analysis, and the outcome of a coding process is called codes. And these codes are the researcher translation of the data, meaning the researcher gives meaning to the data. And also it is used for the purpose of pattern searching and this pattern will be the findings of a qualitative research. To summarize, I have a table that differentiates between the first cycle of coding and second cycle of coding. In this example, I'm showing to you, I'm using causation coding method for the first cycle of coding because it is good to infer causal belief in data. And then in the second cycle of coding, in my illustration, I illustrated pattern coding method. This method is useful to group codes from codes into categories. And these two coding methods have their own purpose. The causation coding is to identify causation's process and how codes are interrelated, to explain concept of human interactions. And then the pattern coding, the purpose of we do pattern coding is to condense codes, which possibly thousands of them, into smaller number of unit, probably from thousands into hundreds. And from that smaller unit, which is categories, and then the researcher need to make decision which category will be used to answer which research question. I hope with my illustration, it will give you some idea on how to do data analysis in qualitative research. And if you have anything to ask or to comment, you can contact me via my email, suhaila423@uitm.edu.my. Thank you for your time and attention. Assalamualaikum. Bye.